So welcome everyone. I'm Mike Simons, the Dean of St. John's Law School, and it's a pleasure to be with you to celebrate the publication of Janis, Sarra, and Cheryl Wade's important book, Predatory Lending and the Destruction of the African American Dream. So I'm on the East Coast in New York, and in the United States, today is Constitution Day, when we celebrate the founding document of our country, which was signed 231 years ago today. And while state action is only an indirect component of predatory lending, it's fitting that we spend today engaging with the issue that was in 1789 and still is today the central challenge of our constitutional democracy, racial justice. And to kick things off, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Cheryl Wade. Cheryl is the Dean Harold F. McNeese Professor of Law here at St. John's, where she teaches a wide variety of courses related to race, racial justice, and business law. She's a frequent recipient of teaching awards at St. John's, including 2 in the past 3 years. Cheryl's been on the St. John's Law faculty for 20 years. Before that, she was on the faculty at Hofstra Law School, her alma mater. She practiced law at a major Manhattan law firm, and she was a bilingual education teacher in the New York City public schools. Most importantly, she's one of the leading voices on structural racism in corporate practices, and I am very pleased to turn the conversation over to her. Cheryl, congratulations on the publication of your book, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that introduction and for your kind words. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. For every dollar of wealth the average white household has, Black households only have 2 cents. Predatory lending and the destruction of the African American dream helps to explain why this racial gap exists. In other words, we provide context for this racial wealth gap. The gap exists, it gets wider and wider because of systemic economic exploitation of African Americans. We describe predatory practices that target African American consumers. We focus primarily, but not exclusively, on the predatory practices of mortgage lenders. We provide context for the racial wealth gap because without context, some will speculate about the causes of the gap. What's wrong with Black Americans, they may wonder? Why, after so many generations, are they still lagging in wealth accumulation? In fact, in the years after the 2008 recession, a victim-blaming narrative emerged. Black borrowers took out mortgages for homes they could not afford. They were too greedy. They were dishonest. This was the dominant narrative. In our book, we tell the narratives that were overlooked, ignored, or distorted. On the cover of the book is the stunning work of multimedia artist Tamashi Jackson. And that's Ms. Marlene Saunders and her Brooklyn brownstone on the cover. I'll tell you just a little bit more about Ms. Saunders' story in a moment, but first, let's go to slide 2 to meet this afternoon's panel. You'll hear from Dr. Janis Sarra, the co-author of the book, Professor Tanya Banks, she wrote the book's foreword, attorney Alice Nicholson works with clients facing foreclosure, and corporate governance scholar Kelly Testy is the CEO of the Law School Admission Council. Charles, please go to slide 3. Janis and I were inspired to write this book while we worked on a project about the foreclosure crisis and its impact on all Americans. And attorney Victoria Brown Douglas was in the audience when we presented the project, and during the question and answer session, she asked us why we had not included discussion of how the foreclosure crisis had impacted Black consumers. So Janis and I began the journey to write this book. And now, in the middle of a national debate about whether systemic anti-Black racism exists, we launch a book that describes a financial system brimming with racism. Let's go to slide 4 so that I can give you a little more background about how the book came to be. Janis and I interviewed predatory lending victims in Detroit, Baltimore, and New York. After we did those interviews, Janis commissioned a song that told the victim stories in an accessible way that could be easily shared with everyone. We recorded this song entitled Homes and Hearts at Bethany Baptist Church in Jamaica, Queens, a neighborhood that is at the epicenter of the attack on home ownership. Charles, would you play the song?
destiny. Oh God, we thank you and we praise you, and we lift you up in Jesus' name. Amen.
Janis and I sincerely thank the individuals we interviewed, the victims of predatory lending, for telling us their stories, the stories that you heard, some of them you heard in the song. Let's move now, Charles, to slide 5, so that we can consider the nature of the predatory lending we describe in the book. We learned in our research and in the interviews that many Black Americans were steered into costly subprime loans, even when they had good credit histories, and even when similarly situated white consumers received lower cost prime loans. Because they did not receive the lower cost prime loans for which they qualified, millions of Black Americans lost homes, and millions of others are still struggling in 2020 to keep their homes as they attempt to navigate a mortgage modification process that is also predatory. Let's go to slide 6 to consider the nature of anti-Black racism in this context. We describe a variety of predatory practices in the book. I have time to give you just one example. Lenders recruited ministers of Black churches to convince their members that home ownership was attainable, and it was attainable. This push to encourage home ownership could have been successful if only the terms of the mortgages were fair, and they were not. It's also clear that much of the predatory conduct was motivated by explicit, conscious anti-Black bias. For example, several former loan officers at Wells Fargo testified at depositions when the financial institution was sued. One loan officer said that Black people in the bank were routinely referred to as mud people. Another loan officer said that the subprime loans into which Black Americans were steered were called ghetto loans. And yet another former officer said that the pervasive perception at the financial institution, at the bank, was that Black people were just not savvy enough to know when they qualified for lower cost loans or prime loans. We don't know whether white Americans, white borrowers, are more savvy or not. And we don't know because white Americans were not systematically targeted. In slide 7, we explain that what we're doing today is unique. Corporate law and racial discussions, racial justice discussions, attract disparate audiences that only rarely come together. Some scholars, including the names you see on this slide, have in fact engaged with the issues that lie at the intersection of race and corporate governance, but this is rare. Our book's focus on corporate governance and race makes it a unique read. Well, back for a moment to Ms. Saunders, who's on the cover. In our book, we describe the predatory practices of private firms, but we include Ms. Saunders' story because it describes public sector predation. Ms. Saunders, a retired nurse, triumphed over a recent attempt by New York City to take her home under the city's third-party transfer program, the TPT program. Eventually, after a long fight, the city reversed the transfer, and we describe the details of Ms. Saunders' ordeal in the book. We also describe the program. I will end my remarks by reading a short excerpt from the book's last chapter. In this book, we tell an integral part of an American story about African-American wealth and accumulation and its subsequent destruction. US history is replete with infrequently told narratives of wealth destruction in African-American communities and families. The Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where African-Americans owned homes and businesses, became known as the Black Wall Street of America. In 1921, white rioters burned this flourishing community to the ground. 2 years later, white rioters burned and destroyed another all-Black town, Rosewood, Florida, where African Americans owned homes and businesses. Few people know of Seneca Village, an almost entirely Black community in the middle of what is now Central Park in New York City, where middle-class African Americans owned their own businesses and homes. The city took the land on which Seneca Village existed through eminent domain. We tell the stories about today's racism, systemic racism in our book, because today's events become tomorrow's history. If we do not confront today's narratives about systemic racism, we will wonder decades from now, why is there still a widening racial wealth gap? I will turn things over now to my co-author, Dr. Janis Sarra at the University of British Columbia. Janis?
Thank you, Cheryl. Next slide, please. So thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, my co-panelists. And almost 450 people have signed up to share this book launch with us. Thank you. As always, I feel deeply privileged to work with Cheryl. And as she said, our book explores how financial markets interacted with systemic racism. Just to give you a sense of it, the subprime lending in the United States surged to 1.2 trillion before the market meltdown. And racism certainly underpinned high pressure tactics in terms of sales. And even after controlling for differences in income and neighborhood, Black American borrowers were 4 times more likely to receive subprime loans than similarly situated white borrowers. So what is it about the market that allowed predatory lending to flourish? Well, the book documents a number of complex reasons for the subprime mortgage collapse. I'll mention 2 here. One is that the expansion of what were called third-party mortgage servicing firms created all of the wrong incentives regarding their conduct. Volume of sales was paramount, and sales depended on them hiding fees that rewarded them for selling loans that had no caps on the amount of interest that could be charged. And many had complex interest resetting terms that even the most financially literate consumers could not understand. The second was a tide of deregulation in the US and other financial markets, and such that there was a huge failure of regulatory oversight. Securitization, for example, resulted in mortgage lenders offloading their own risks by bundling, repackaging, and selling in tranches billions of dollars of mortgages in the market to school boards, municipalities, and pensioners who thought they were buying them as secure investments. And complex derivatives transactions also eventually helped precipitate the meltdown. Next slide, please. So the book offers detailed evidence that lenders, brokers, and mortgage servicers engaged in conduct that was fraudulent and misleading. And if I could just read a brief excerpt. The list of misconduct is almost too egregious to comprehend. It includes violation of federal loan statutes, securities law violations, fraud, including invalid notarizations, forged signatures, and changing applicants' income amounts after they submitted their applications. Now, legislative reforms to financial regulation since 2008 have made some improvements in terms of protecting investors and depositors from banks' failure. But those reforms are really aimed at protection of capital and liquidity requirements, and almost no attention has been paid to the massive financial losses to borrowers for foreclosures. The government missed opportunities to enact changes, for example, to bankruptcy legislation requiring that lenders negotiate reductions on overinflated house prices. And even as banks were failing, they were spending millions lobbying US Congress not to enact a proposal. Ultimately, consumer mortgage borrowers paid dearly financially, socially, emotionally, and physically for the decision by legislators to bail out banks and other financial institutions rather than direct some of those substantial resources to the millions of borrowers whose homes were lost. Essentially, the measures put the foxes in charge of the hen house, in that they relied on the same market participants that had engaged in unethical practices to roll out their programs. Next slide, please. So there was some relief, but the question was to who? The Department of Justice and 49 states' attorney generals banded together and brought lawsuits, and we examined in great detail almost 20 lawsuits and the results. And the global settlements, $119 billion, is huge by anybody's measure. But the majority went to investors and state authorities, and only a fraction went to the 17 million families that were foreclosed on in the decade immediately after. Next slide, please. And this visual is just an example of the RBC settlement. And we track what happened. Basically, we track thousands of pages of settlements, monitors reports, and bank reports as to where the money went. And here again, I want to thank our research assistant, Mary Grace Johnson, for her tenacious tracking of where the money went. But you can see here, of a $12.6 billion settlement, $12.1 billion went to investors and the government agencies. Next slide, please. And what we're witnessing now is new iterations of predatory lending. So subprime, by any other name, includes now non-prime mortgages, one mod, which are modification strategies. The government divested oversight of mortgage modifications to the private sector, and the third-party predation that Cheryl just talked about. Even after the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act and creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and in spite of already existing law that is supposed to prohibit lending discrimination, many borrowers are victimized by new schemes when they ask lenders to modify the predatory loans. Next slide, please. So the book contains a number of recommendations of policy and regulatory form of holding lenders and the corporate directors that have oversight, holding them more accountable. I think it's also important to note that since the book went to press, we are seeing deep linkages between systemic economic racism, financial markets, and now climate change risk, a growing pressing problem that we collectively need to address. So I'm going to end my part with one last excerpt. Reform will not eradicate racism, but it can mitigate its impact on vulnerable individuals and communities. Reform will only work if the historical context of the economic exploitation of African Americans is acknowledged and understood. Effective reform has been elusive, in large part because lenders have settled litigation that provided convincing evidence of their predation without acknowledging their wrongdoing. Settlements expedite resolution of lawsuits, but without judgments on the merit, there are no established facts and no corporate or personal liability placed on the perpetrators of abusive or fraudulent conduct. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Tanya.
Hi, I want to thank the authors for their invitation to me to participate in this book launch. I'm a really big fan of this book. I became involved with the book project about 2 years ago when I volunteered to drive Professors Wade and Sarra through some neighborhoods in Baltimore, Maryland, heavily impacted by the 2008 housing crisis. I also helped them to identify a local small business owner who lost her home due to predatory lending practices. In fact, she is the first person, the hairdresser, who is mentioned in the song Homes and Hearts. African-American homeowners and communities in Baltimore were targeted by predatory lenders like Wells Fargo. So in 2008, the city of Baltimore sued the bank, claiming that their lending practices were unlawful, deceptive, and discriminatory, that their practices caused foreclosures on the bank's loans against predominantly African-American homeowners, and that these practices were a substantial factor contributing to urban blight in some predominantly Black areas of the city. The case was settled in 2012, and the city received $7.5 million, some of which was designated for approximately 1,000 city residents. The settlement also included monies for programs aimed at improving the community, along with foreclosure prevention programs and plans devoted to housing issues in troubled neighborhoods. Predatory lending and the destruction of the African-American dream helps to explain why places like Baltimore were so heavily impacted by the housing crisis. Professors Wade and Sarra expose how opaque financial transactions, like those used by Wells Fargo, undercut Black home ownership. The authors advance 3 reasons for the targeting of African Americans. First, greed. There were profits to be made from the lucrative bonuses and fees that motivated lenders to steer otherwise qualified borrowers toward predatory loans. A second factor was racial segregation. Persistent residential segregation made it easy for lenders to identify and target African Americans. And the third reason already mentioned was anti-Black bias. It's no accident that the overwhelming majority of the lenders and the investors who profited from the predatory lending system were white. The authors argue that there was a conflation of racism, individual, structural, institutional, and systemic, that gave rise to the problem. Laws and policies facilitated the loss of homes, as did longstanding efforts, both legal and illegal, to extract property and resources from Black communities. The authors remind us, as it's already been mentioned, that these predatory practices persist today, although in slightly different form. My interactions with Professors Wade and Sarra occurred as I was putting together material for my economic justice seminar. I was especially interested in their take on the racial aspect of the 2008 housing crisis and why African Americans, who only recently gained wider access to home ownership, were especially hard hit. The authors shared their draft with me and then generously allowed me to use several chapters from their book in my seminar. My students came away with a better understanding of the structural problems leading to the housing crisis, especially the crisis as it impacted Baltimore. They told me that they especially enjoyed the narratives that are interwoven throughout the book about how everyday people became caught in these lending schemes because they put a human face on the problem. Predatory Lending and the Destruction of the African American Dream is an important book that discusses the housing crisis from a different perspective. The authors use financial market theory, corporate theory, bankruptcy principles, and critical race theory to document how large financial institutions intentionally targeted Black homeowners and mortgage applicants using predatory lending schemes. They present their evidence and arguments in a way that makes the book very accessible. It is a book that should appeal to a wide range of readers beyond lawyers and law students. I'll turn it over to Alice.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Wade and Professor Sarra, for your brilliant work and for the opportunity to be part of this project. In July this year, the Federal Reserve Bank reaffirmed that foreclosure affected Black and brown residents disproportionately. The book enlightens us, Black and brown homeowners, renters, and their families. In the past decade, my clients have been teachers, nurses, taxi drivers, school bus drivers, court employees, policemen, sanitation workers, doctors, civil servants, to name a few. They drive our trains and trucks. They care for us in hospitals. They build bridges. They repair our homes. They've worked in banks and insurance companies. Some ran their own businesses, and they are all medium income, hardworking people. Among those affected by foreclosure judgments and evictions are our friends, our neighbors, our close relatives, their children, the most delicate among us, who've lost the security and comfort of singing, dancing, playing, learning in their homes, sleeping in their own beds. In 2010, New York University Furman Center wrote of the collateral costs of foreclosure for school-aged children. When the marshal evicts, they may end up with family or friends or they may become homeless. Many experience considerable trauma, stress, depression, inability to focus, causing poor performance in school. In 2016, about 45,000 New York City children entered the shelter system. More than half were African Americans. How many were the result of foreclosure, we have not counted yet. In 2008, the New York legislature responded to the foreclosure crisis by mandating that courts conduct settlement conferences between borrowers and lenders in order to restructure subprime loans to conventional types. Though this effort was pioneering, its execution largely failed because this program is unimaginative and uncommitted to the legislative intent of saving working family homes. Some families do get help. More face the daunting truth that they have to leave their homes, even when they qualify for a modification. So how did these hard-working families, essential workers, end up on the losing end? As you heard, the banking industry shifted the blame of the foreclosure crisis away from themselves and to the Black and brown homeowners, and they mounted a propaganda campaign which judges and attorneys have heard. They called us irresponsible, deadbeats, free riders, degrading terms that are used to describe African Americans for centuries. They falsely said that African American borrowers were low income, didn't put money down, didn't invest in their loans and homes, and caused the mortgage crisis when they are the ones and the Great Recession that were the cause of the crisis. Today, judges often ask us, attorneys, if our clients want a free house. When we try to uphold well-entrenched legal rights, the right to service of the summons and complaint, the right to pre-foreclosure notices, the right to know who's suing, we often ask, what's the game plan here? As if we, members of the bar and homeowners, are involved in trickery. Lenders' attorneys blurt out talking points like, the lender has paid the taxes and insurance for years, the borrowers have been in foreclosure for years, when their clients are the ones who have been recalcitrant when it comes to restructuring loans. Generally speaking, African American homeowners in particular face a hostile climate when they come to court hoping for a fair play. Foreclosure courts are courts of equity, meaning that judges have the power to hear both sides and decide fairly and equitably, especially when the terms of the mortgage contracts are unjust and unconscionable. In this book, you will read about some of the borrowers' tireless efforts to secure loan modification. Our state court system is more focused on clearing their dockets than helping homeowners to remain in their homes, even when a restructured mortgage will be affordable. Deceased Brooklyn Judge Kramer understood that subprime loans were reverse redlining. They were the basis of that, which means that predatory lenders targeted communities based on race. Judge Kramer urged equity to intervene and to ask courts to stop acting like machines, mindlessly rubber stamping papers to advance foreclosure sales. This book calls on all of us, judges, lawyers, educators, advocates, concerned citizens, investors, to begin now to help our honest, decent, hardworking fellow Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Kelly?
Thank you, Cheryl. Professor Wade, Professor Sarra, this is a remarkable work, and I want to thank you both, Professors Banks and Ms. Nicholson as well, for the collaboration that's brought this forward. I admire it deeply, and I want to start my remarks with a little bit of a story, and that is that when I was teaching corporate law before I became a dean and now leading LSAC, I had a student come up to me one day and say, you know, Professor Testi, I'd like to take your class because I understand that you care a lot about equality and work in an anti-racist way, but I want to do civil rights and I want to do critical race theory. And so I don't know why I would take a course in corporate law or follow that. And I explained then, you're exactly the person we need to be studying these subjects so that you can follow the money and you can understand where the abuses are happening and how work through law and through corporate law in particular might be the destruction of the African American dream and the dream of the promise of equal justice that we all hold so dear. So I want to commend this work because it is a wonderful fusion of work that looks critically at race in America in this case, and also goes deep into how our systems of corporate law and financial law have exacerbated issues of inequality. And this kind of work is one that all of us in the Legal Academy, for those who are watching today there, I hope will take up in earnest, because not only does it reveal and give ideas for reform, it goes deep to show exactly what's happening so that we know where those interventions are needed. And I want to make a point too as I do that today, and that not only does this show that we need policy reform and we need more commitment toward equality, but the not surprising to me, I have to say, but very disappointing result of this investigation is that you see over and over again failures of law and enforcement at very basic levels. So that when we start to talk about corporate governance and all the changes that might be made, we can start by saying, let's enforce the law that's at least there. And that widespread illegality is, of course, something that should bring forward all of our attention. I also want to make one last point today before I turn this back over to you. And that is that one of the words that just kept ringing through my head as I read this work and listened to all of you today is the word compound. And the reason that I think about that is that when we talk about business law and we talk about money, so often what people will do is make the point that the time value of money, that interest compounds, and how money can grow in ways bigger than you expect because of the way that compound interest works. Well, compound bias is that in reverse. And it shouldn't be that our world is one where white gets to talk about compound interest and black and brown people in our world are talking about compound bias and feeling the effects of that. And when you make the point that it's $1 to 2 cents in terms of wealth disparity, Professor Wade, and then how taking away assets, as we've seen happen here, can compound that bias even more. You've done an excellent job in this work in making that point. So I look forward to what this can spur, both in our thinking as academics, but in our action also for equity out in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for your comments, and especially about the discussion of the wealth disparity and your point about compounding. We have a question in the chat that I'd like to direct to Janis. You started answering this question to some extent, Janis, and the question is, have any class action lawsuits resulted from racially discriminatory consumer lending practices or mortgage lending practices? Wells Fargo paid a fine, as I recall. Were any Black homeowners compensated for predatory loans? Now, you addressed that in your comments, but I don't know if you want to elaborate on that with respect to or in light of this question.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. So first of all, the Wells Fargo case was brought. I mean, there were cases brought against Wells Fargo based on fraud and securities law violation, but there was also an anti-racism suit brought against Wells Fargo. Again, it's settled without any admission of liability. It's settled for $184 million, of which a certain amount, $50 million, was meant to go towards assisting consumer borrowers in communities hard hit by the housing crisis. Remarkably, though, the grand focus of the attention was on the what I call the securities lawsuits. In other words, regulators or states attorney generals and departments of justice really went after these predatory lenders primarily to protect market participants. And the vast majority of market participants, of course, are white. And so there was an imbalance in the kind of litigation that happened. And there weren't as many, there were very few, in fact, lawsuits on racial discrimination. Wells Fargo was easy to establish in the sense that a number of officers testified, and Cheryl, you gave a couple of examples of that, but the affidavits are a remarkable reading in terms of the kind of targeting specifically of local churches, local communities, going after older Black Americans who had completely paid off their homes, telling them that they were getting a home equity loan, which was in fact very predatory. So I've answered it in a long form, but I think some money did go to consumer mortgage borrowers, and we're not saying it didn't. But when you think about what we're talking about is 119 trillion, a remarkably little amount went, as best as we can figure, but there has been no one who has been willing to add it up completely. And as I mentioned, we went through about 4,000 or 5,000 pages of records to get the data that we got. But we think it's probably more like about 500,000 people out of 17 million that got anything at all.
Thank you, Janis. There's a question for you, Dean Testi. Would you mind repeating the comment about compound interest?
Sure, thank you. I was really just struck today as I, reflected more about this concept of and that word of compounding, because when we compound interest, what you're doing is you're getting interest on interest, and when you make an investment, it's amazing how much it can grow because of that. But what that really means is you're earning something on what you've earned. And I was really struck because of my work in equality that we also too often see bias compounding. Women of color particularly experience that, where bias because of gender and bias because of race add together and create even additional barriers. And so what I think this work is really doing is helping us see that there is racism everywhere in every aspect of what we do. And even in a word like compound or compounding, we see that it can benefit some groups and hurt other groups. My mind went further to even the way the word compound has come to mean a collection of homes, that someone has a compound. But guess what else it's used to describe? Often a prison compound. So there's just, I think we need to attend everywhere to the ways that even our basic language, not to mention a concept like interest, can really work to the advantage of some and the deep detriment of others.
Thank you, Kelly. I have another question. For all of the touted work supposedly done on behalf of the Black community by the Trump administration, has it done anything in this area to correct the problem, or has it deepened the problem, or just done nothing? I'm not sure who wants to handle that question.
I'll start. As the Canadian in the panel, I'll start. But I know you all have a lot more information, but I'll just mention a few things. I already mentioned that regulatory oversight of mortgage modifications was given back to the private sector. And what you are having now is, this was a Trump decision, and what is happening now is that people are able to renegotiate their mortgages if they've still managed to hold on to their home after 10 years of fighting. But these are now 45 and 50-year mortgages, which means they'll never pay them off because they're not going to work that many years. The second thing is, and this is the stealth part, I think, is for those of us that track financial markets, Trump has been slowly unraveling the protections of the Dodd-Frank Act. They're really going under the radar. Most of the unraveling accrues to the benefit of the financial firms and to the detriment of not only consumer mortgage borrowers, but also investors.
Thank you.
Professor Wade, I might mention one other quick idea there too, is that as I, thought about this concept of the compounding bias, this has been theft. This has taken someone's money, and we often talk about the need for reparations. And this is, I think, another instance where that claim is very strong.
Yeah, I have a comment here from Dean Len Baines. I love the concept of compound bias as related to intersectionality. Not a question, but I just wanted to let you know about that comment. Here's another question. Are there any legislative initiatives that address the problems set out in the book? Janis, why don't you take that one?
Well, I think, Cheryl, you should step up, but I will start. And, so there's a whole range of things. And the book talks about proposals for bankruptcy reform. Currently, you cannot negotiate down the principal. If you have a house that you have a $500,000 mortgage on and it's now worth $200,000, you can't compromise that debt in bankruptcy proceedings in the US. And yet, if you were a business, you could compromise your debt. So it doesn't seem very fair. We also recommend that there should be an affirmative action program for all of the people that lost their homes. So there should be some sort of offer, we think, of fair fixed rate mortgages, some compensation or reconciliation with what happened. And, it was only about 2 years later that the banks were making record profits again. So what is wrong with this picture? That is that they've made it on the backs of losses of life savings of millions and millions of people. So there could be policy measures that just arbitrarily say, you need to now do this. You need to now go back to the neighborhoods that you foreclosed on. There's other creative things in the city of Barcelona. They have a program where if a place is vacant for 2 years, they just completely give it over to social housing. So there could be programs like that to say, if you sit on a foreclosed building, and we all know there are hundreds of neighborhoods in the United States now that streets and streets are boarded up, give them back to the people that lost their homes, and then finance on favorable terms how they can actually repair them to make them livable again. We also think, and I'll turn it over to Cheryl for some other ideas, but we also think this idea of imposing a duty of care on mortgage lenders and also on the directors and officers that are the principals of the companies, the firms, the banks, et cetera, would be huge. In other words, that discrimination could lead to direct remedies by people who've been foreclosed on, and it would facilitate class actions. But more importantly, it should facilitate more responsible lending behavior and more responsible behavior once people are in the mortgage market. Cheryl, do you want to add a few things?
Well, your point about fiduciary duty, I think would work better in Canada than it would here in the US, because we do give a lot of lip service to fiduciary duty, but the duty of care is almost empty rhetoric at this point. With respect to compliance with law, though, we have been analyzing in this country fiduciary duty, or the duty to monitor compliance with law, as a duty of loyalty problem, where we could actually have shareholders file suits against boards that allow this to happen. This was a serious corporate governance failure. It was a failure to monitor law. And we think that fiduciary duty, at least with respect to monitoring compliance with law, might be helpful. But of course, only shareholders, activist shareholders, perhaps shareholders who are socially responsible would be able to bring that kind of suit. But we do propose broadening the duty and imposing it, or having the duty run to non-shareholder constituencies, which I think would be far easier to do in Canada than it would be here. I have another question. What changes in laws do you propose to prevent this from recurring? Or do you think these problems can be solved without changing laws? Janis just talked about some potential changes, but I happen to think that the problems could be solved without changing law. We've got an awful lot of legislation and regulation in this regard. And one reason I find hope within the corporate context, Dean Testi mentioned a student who wanted to practice civil rights law, and you gave her the advice, Dean Testi gave her the advice, well, we need to know where the money is going, or where it's flowing. I think what we need to change, and this is the beauty of corporate governance, we need to change corporate cultures. We need to change corporate climates. The people at the top, the CEOs, they and other senior leaders, they set the tone at firms. And I think that serious compliance with law would prevent some of the corporate governance failures that we've seen. There's another question here. Can you speak to the problem of markets for Black people as they seek to make progress in this country? Tanya, I don't know if you dealt with any of that in your economic justice class. Do you want to tackle that very good question? But only do so after you, oh, good, okay.
Well, I've been sitting here listening to you, and I suppose I'm the cynic of the group. I mean, if in fact the system is already skewed in against Black people, if the problem is institutional, systemic, individual racism, I think it is very difficult, as long as these institutions, the financial institutions in particular, are being operated by people whose interest is the dominant culture, to bring some of these changes about. I mean, I do think, we talk in my class, this is critical race theory, we talk about the need for education, but even with education and about finances, we talk about education being taught, this kind of education being taught in the schools, in high school. I'm not so sure that that's enough. That I think that we have to change the nature of the country. And all right, you will hate me because I'm not a real big corporate person, but capitalism and predatory capitalism, which is what we have right now, is a real problem. And what sort of drove me nuts about the 2008 financial crisis is nobody went to jail. And until people go to jail, the financial institutions are not going to take this issue seriously. I hope that's okay.
That is just fine. I happen to agree with you. Here's a question for you, Alice. How do we think the bank reform that has occurred to date will deter banks from foreclosing on Black and brown borrowers impacted by COVID-19? And then I just want to combine that with another question that's related. What do you think is a sustainable process that would lead to a solution to reduce and eventually eliminate predatory lending behavior? What are your comments about that?
Well, first we have to have some legislative reform, and also the courts have to take the problem seriously. Now, we've talked about structural racism in court and the views that the society have on us as Black people. So we have to start re-educating or judges of all colors, or lawyers of all colors, or people of all colors, to think about the effect that it has on fellow citizens, fellow community residents. It affects all of us, so we all have to get in there and do some reforms. The bankruptcy court, actually, I find a little more serious about taking on the issue of predatory lending and predatory modifications. They
Thanks,
really have a system in place. They could do more, of course, with some legislative help, but they do have a system that kind of works.
Thanks, Alice. Here's a question about whether lender behavior has changed. And this question mentions the current era of rocket mortgages, and whether Black and brown borrowers are still being targeted for subprime loans and other predatory loan vehicles. The answer to that very good question is absolutely. Subprime loans are now being called, they've been slightly changed, and they're now called non-prime loans, with many of the same characteristics of the subprime loans. There are so many other schemes that relate to home ownership that are still targeted or steered or aimed at Black consumers. And as I said in my comments, some of it is even predation from the public sector, like the TPT, the third party transfer program. That is supposed to be a program that resolves urban blight by looking at abandoned homes, taking abandoned homes that are in a state of disrepair, and transferring them to private firms. Some of them are for-profit, some of them are not for-profit, who will then develop those properties and then supply affordable housing. As I said to you, Ms. Saunders was a victim of this TPT program within the last 1 or 2 years, and her home was not in a state of disrepair. There was no mortgage on her home, no loans. She had the home had been in her family for 30 years. And all of a sudden, when her family went to pay a bill, they were told that the property was in the process of being transferred to a developer for no reason, other than that is now a neighborhood that is desirable and a neighborhood that has been targeted for urban renewal. It is now 6:30, and I'm so sorry we didn't get to some of these other very excellent questions. Thank you for those questions, but we are committed to ending on time. As you can see, we had a panel today of all women, and I think all of us are baby boomers. So forgive us for the trouble that we had with the technology. I couldn't see myself at first, and I had to ask, am I on? And there I was. And Alice, we're so happy to see you now. But thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I appreciate your support. Janis and I appreciate your being here. Thank you,
Thank you.
very much. Bye-bye.